Alrighty, so topic 2, the history of policing. So before we begin this, I want to let you know that this particular video, and also some other videos that you'll hear in this class, and probably in my research methods class, I've recorded this video before when I was a professor at USI, the University of Southern Indiana. Yeah, I know. I lived in Southern Indiana. Why would I do that? I don't know, but I did it. It is done, okay? So I recorded this lecture before. And so what I decided to do was listen to it, and I found a bunch of stuff where I just sort of dropped the ball, or it just wasn't good enough, or, you know. So what I did was I opened up that file, and now I am recording some additional stuff over it. So you might hear some fluctuations in the audio. And you also might hear some references to Indiana. You might be like, why are you talking about Indiana? Well, it's because I'm trying to save time here. All right, let's see how this goes. Clickety clack to the following. If it will ever. Okay, there we go. Aha. Oh, look, I did this weird animation thing. I don't think I'm going to do a lot more of these animations because what's the point? Okay, anyways. So you're like, why do I have to learn the history of policing today, man? Like I don't care, right? I get that. Like, I had to take this class at a different university, obviously, when I was an undergrad, and I was like, dude, let's hear about frickin' detective work and all that cool stuff. I don't really care about the history of policing. It's fair. It is kind of boring. Or is it? I don't know. Okay, so the reason why I want us to learn the history of policing, because when we understand something's backstory, we understand why it's doing the things it does today. So, the English heritage, much like everything else in this country, we took a lot from the English, right? Like, we took rugby from the English and turned it into American football. We took cricket from the English and turned it into baseball. And then we took the metric system and we decided to come up with our weird system. A lot of law enforcement occurs on a local level. So what I mean by this is, right, when you drive across, maybe think about it, think about driving across the country. I don't know if any of you have driven far, at least, right, but as you drive, right, you see different colored cop cars as you enter new jurisdictions, right? That fragmented aspect of American policing is something we took from England, in that each jurisdiction has its own police force, right? So it has its own local police force, right? And then you have a state police force that sort of deals with certain duties, and we're going to go over that with the next PowerPoint. And then you have federal law enforcement, right? And they have their duties as well. Now, most of the law enforcement that occurs in the United States happens on a local level. And there's more than like 15,000 different types of local agencies across the country. I mean, think about even here in Evansville, right? We often see the Evansville police officers driving around, and we also see the Vanderburgh County sheriffs. It's because we operate here, living in Evansville, on the border of these two jurisdictions, right? The Evansville City jurisdiction and then the Vanderburgh County jurisdiction. So we see those two types of cops all the time. And that is a system we took from England, right? In my time living in South Africa, right, there was only one police agency called SAP or SAPS, the South African Police Service, right? In many other countries across the world, there's only like one federal police agency, and they do everything from like the FBI level type stuff all the way down to local law enforcement. And from what I can remember, and again, do not quote me on this, I think that the South Africans had like separate traffic police, but I think that was still that still fell under the SAPS like bureaucracy. So Who knows? So again, we rely a lot on local law enforcement, and because we do that, we have decentralized policing. That's the term we use. We decentralized it, right? If the FBI just ran the whole show, we just had the USPS. Wait, that's the U.S. Postal Service. Okay. If we didn't have, the USPA, the U.S. Police Agency, right? And it was just one police agency, had one chief, right? And they were just in charge of all the police. It would be a super centralized policing. But we are decentralized because we have many agencies at different levels. So it's fragmented in that we have many jurisdictions at the same level, right? So many local jurisdictions, it's fragmented. And then it's decentralized in that we have these different levels of policing. We had Robert Peel, and this is a name you'll see a lot in policing. He was known for turning LMP into a proper professional police agency, right? He's known as the father of modern policing because many other modern police agencies have structured themselves after the LMPs, right? Also, when you're walking around England, if you've ever done that, it's pretty cool. London is okay. I mean, the rest of England is really cool. If you ever go to England, go hang out in the rest of England. London just looks like any other city. But if you ever encounter the police, they used to refer to them at least as bobbies, right? Because of Robert Peel. So they're like Robert's boys and girls, bobbies, right? So when Robert Peel created this first modern police agency, right, there are three things that were very important to him, and that was the police had to have a mission, right? They had to have a written down official purpose. Our mission is to X, Y, Z. And then they had to have an official strategy for how to achieve that goal. And then also they had to borrow their organizational structure from the military, right? They had to be disciplined and well-oiled, like the military, right? And that's why we refer to the police as either paramilitary or quasi-military. You can use those two terms interchangeably, right? For instance, now with the police, you start off with the chief of police. Sometimes if it's a massive agency, you'll have a commissioner, and then under the commissioner, there'll be different chiefs, and then you'll get like assistant chiefs and deputy chiefs, and then captains or majors, right? Some places will have majors, and then captains, and then lieutenants, and then sergeants, and then corporals, and then private first class, and then officers. And so that organizational structure where there is a central command, right? For instance, at Evansville Police Department, if Chief Boland says this is what we're going to do, then that's what they're going to do because he is at the top of that bureaucracy, right? If a sergeant says something to a patrol officer, the patrol officer has to listen to that sergeant, right? It's a very military or paramilitary organizational structure. And those are some of the aspects of modern policing. And the way that occurred for the first time at LMP, and this was all because of Robert Peel. So this was Robert Peel's brainchild, and now it's pretty much impacted most of the police agencies in this country, in America. Right, again, another thing we took from our English heritage. All right. So, a bunch of English people popped over from Europe back in the day, and they wanted to find a new world to live in the United States, right, or in the Americas, and as more people started coming over with the boats, they started settling, and the more people showed up, the more people were acting like fools, and they needed to be controlled. And so, bam! We have to start thinking about how are we going to... First of all, we need to make some rules, and then we need to enforce those rules. How are we going to do it? Well, boom. Let's bring in sheriffs. Right, so side story, where does the word sheriff come from? Well, again, under the English common law system, you had these, back in the day, you had these different shires, right, across England, and these shires were then, you had these reefs who were supposed to sort of police these shires as a representative of the king, right, and so a shire is kind of like a county, right? And so these these reefs of the shires became known as shire reefs. And so over time, that word has become sheriff. You had your sheriff, so different counties or towns or stuff had a sheriff, right? And these people were known as the most important law enforcement agents, and they were typically appointed by the governor or by a mayor or something like that. And, they had a very broad role at that point. They were just sort of like the people to make sure that things were running smoothly, right? So the sheriff was not just in charge of enforcing the law, although that took up a lot of although that was also a responsibility, they also had to make sure elections happened, right? They supervised them, made sure things went smoothly, right? They also had to help maintain infrastructure, right? So they weren't just law enforcement agents. They had a very broad role. Again, remember, this is colonial America, right? Things are pretty grassroots still. Things are pretty undeveloped, right? Then you had constables, or whatever. They had very, very similar duties as the sheriff, and sometimes you'd have a town that wouldn't have a sheriff, and they just have a constable, right? And they would pretty much do the exact same thing as a sheriff. There wouldn't be that much status as being a sheriff. And at some point, it went from being a position that was elected to just being something that's appointed. The nice thing about being a constable also was that there's lots of money involved with it. And then I'd say what became sort of, so the two things that have shaped existing policing today would probably be the watch and slave patrols, right? Now, with slave patrols, this was something that was completely American, right? We don't know of any other places that had slave patrols, but these were white people who would go on nightly patrols and make sure that slaves were staying in their place, not causing revolts, right? And if slaves did try to do a revolt, the slave patrol would come and keep them down, right? So these are literally people making sure slaves weren't running away, they weren't planning revolts, they weren't doing anything they weren't supposed to be doing. Literally policing the slaves to make sure that they stayed in their place. And then the watch wasn't quite as oppressing, I guess. These are just random people, kind of like you have like neighborhood watches today, but they're just a little more armed. Pretty much all adults were supposed to be on watch at some point at night, and then as cities grew and things became more structured, it evolved into a paid position, like a professional position. And then around the 1830s and 1840s, the United States started implementing some of these more modern police agencies, right? And this really happened because the old system just could not handle industrialization. Those of you who don't know what industrialization is, it's when pretty much when technology got to the point where we could start living in massive cities, and we had factories, and a lot of people from the surrounding farms could come into the city and work in a factory. And so what that did was it just just the influx of people moving to major cities just, intensified. And so the existing system just could not handle it. So they had to come up with a new way of policing. And so Robert Peel did his thing with the LMPs, the bobbies, right, in England. And so we took that same system and we implemented it in America. Now, these police officers did not wear uniforms, right, but they had a hat and a badge, so you could at least see them sticking out from the crowds, right? They also didn't carry firearms. I think they carried like wooden batons or something. Don't quote me on that. But as you'll notice, these people were pretty much hired due to political connections. So it became a paid profession, right? It became a profession, but it was mainly because you knew somebody, right? And so, unfortunately, this sort of led to what is known as the political era, which we'll discuss next. But again, the modern police, they had a mission, and their mission was, we're going to prevent crime, right? We're going to stop crime in its tracks. And the way we're going to do that is by visible patrol. People are going to see us walking around, right? And then in order to be efficient, they took this paramilitary organizational structure which centralized bureaucracy, which means if crime is not being prevented, someone can be held accountable, right? The chief can yell at his lieutenant or her lieutenant. The lieutenant can yell at her sergeant, or sergeant can yell at her patrol officer, right? It's centralized accountability. So there are several aspects of the political era that we will discuss in the coming slides here. So, back in the political era, we were, unfortunately, the police were victims of the patronage system, where essentially, if you wanted to be a cop, you had to be appointed or hired by the people who won office, right? So you essentially became the government goon, right? You did the dirty work of the person in charge, right? And at the same time, there was no job security. People were fired at will, right? There's almost no training at all. You got your badge and your baton, and then if there were rules, you would get that, and bam, now you're a cop, right? Now you are now you're going to do the bidding of whoever is in charge. Patrol work was pretty rough. It was inefficient, right? Again, these were large cities with a small amount of people, right? So you weren't able to police your entire beat necessarily, right? Nor were you able to really communicate with other officers. When you were in trouble, you didn't have a two-way radio, right? Towards the end of this era, they came up with these call boxes where you would be able to call to the police station, right? But citizens could not call the police. And then there was almost no supervision, meaning that your sergeant was probably unable to see what you were doing on the job. So if you wanted just to go find a place to take a nap, or if you just wanted to shake people down all day, you could do that, and there'd be very limited accountability. Because of the high turnover rates during this era, the police officers did not really get to know the citizens in their beat. Again, in the political era, when you are appointed by someone because you support them, right, there was a lot of opportunity for other types of corruption, right? You were doing the dirty work of politicians, right? There was a lot of bribery, a lot of graft, right? You were mainly just a government goon, right? If you were appointed under the patronage system, right, the politicians would use you to discriminate against the groups who were not in power. Roosevelt, right, who we all just sort of see him as this president that we have to learn about in high school or whatever. But he was actually a pretty cool president. Like, if you go ahead and just like Wikipedia him, just like look up everything that he's done, he was actually a pretty sweet, pretty good dude. Probably one of my favorite American presidents, I'd say, at this point. But at some point, he was also police commissioner in New York City, and he wanted to crack down on this whole Tammany Hall political machine. Right? Now, he wasn't super successful, but he did try some things, right? He would sometimes go out on the streets at night, right? And he would try to catch officers sleeping on the job, right? Or he'd catch them getting drunk or catch them doing something wrong, right? He tried to raise personnel standards, right? He tried to sort of undo some of these things, some of these structures that had happened during the political era, but it was pretty much to no avail, right? After he left, things just went bad again. But when he was commissioner, he was very, very serious about changing things. But it was to no avail, really. But some politicians sort of symbolically also tried to reform the police. Again, it was no secret to the public that the police was corrupt, right? So the politicians would say, we have now fired all of the bad officers and replaced them with the good ones. Yeah, well, the good ones are just the new officers who adhere to my political standards, right? So things never really changed. One thing that people used to attribute to the police back in the day is that they said, as soon as the police became modernized during the political era, people became more civil. And so a lot of people would say that the police caused that. But a lot of scholars now are saying no, the police only played a supporting role in the civility that followed industrialization. And what we mean by that is that when people started living together in cities, right, you would expect things to go insane. People just start murdering each other left and right, right? But people became a little more civil. And so there are many explanations for that. A lot of people said that it was mainly because of the police, but they just played a minor role in it, right? It could have been other things like business opportunity, right? Or just the basic social contract, or the basic hedonistic calculus. It might just be better for me to be nice, because then more people will be nice to me, and then I won't get killed or stabbed or attacked. In fact, the political era sort of started this whole police versus society vibe that still exists today. It's just different segments of society that are now against the police, right? Like in today's world, you have this whole Black Lives Matter movement that is stemmed from the difficulties that stemmed from the strain of the relationship between the black community and the police, right? But this strain between certain segments of society and the police was something that very much came from the political era. All right, and so in the beginning of the 1900s, we started seeing the beginnings of the professional era. And if you were to tell me who's one person that was probably the most influential, I'd say it was probably August Vollmer. I mean, and a lot of scholars would agree with me on that. That he was sort of the father of American police professionalism and modern criminal justice education. He took part in writing the Wickersham Commission report, which was the Wickersham Commission was a national commission to observe law enforcement in the country, and so they went and they did a bunch of studies. They studied several law enforcement agencies in the country, and then they published all of these reports that highlighted some problems in American policing at the time. And so Vollmer was responsible for writing a report that sort of set the standards for what should professional policing be. and that is the police has to be defined as a profession, right? This meant that the police have become public servants with a professional obligation to serve the entire community. So this is where the police, who no longer care about political affiliation or about racial background or any of that, this is where those ideas started coming in. The police what we're seeing in the police today, right? They've completely eliminated political influences from policing, right? They started hiring qualified top executives, right? So instead of being, my buddy is mayor, so he made me, police chief, or my buddy is, is the county treasurer, so he hooked me up with this job as a captain in the police agency. That no longer happened. Now it is, now when people were appointed to these positions, it was because of their qualifications, not because of their connections. At least that was a theory behind it. They raised personnel standards, especially for the rank and file officers, right? They started saying, well, you can't be, they started setting minimal intelligence requirements, right? Certain training, make sure that people were in shape, people weren't drunks, right? They started setting up academies. They started looking at the business world and seeing what types of management strategies they use in the business world and started implementing those in police agencies. And then also, something that still very much exists today is specialized units, right? Units of police officers who deal with certain issues. Like here in Evansville, we have the Viper Squad, right? And we have the crime prevention units, and we have SWAT, and FTOs, and K9, and Bomb Squad, right? This all came from the features of the professional era, of which August Vollmer was the father. And so today, we are in the era of conflicting pressures. And this is from the 60s to now. To many people in this country, whether you believe this or not, the police have become a symbol of white power and authority. Right? I mean, if you were to go look at any police agency today, most of the time you'll find white male officers as those police officers. And there's nothing against the police or white male police officers. It is just a truth that exists that we cannot sweep under the rug. That the police are still primarily white. And so this is something that has changed. It has been changing over time. So if you know of 3 black police officers, good for you. It doesn't mean that things have changed. Okay, you might have seen some of those changes occur, but on the whole, on average, things are still in the process of changing. I say that one of the biggest changes in this era is the importance of research. Police science has really improved over the last 50 years. Now, whether the police actually pay attention to that or not, that's a whole nother ball game, right? And something that we've learned was that rapid response to crime doesn't necessarily decrease it. A reactive approach to crime doesn't necessarily work. Randomly increasing the amount of patrol in your city does not necessarily work, right? So we challenged a lot of the basic assumptions about policing. A lot of people think that if you just increase the amount of police you have, you'll have less crime. But we know that's not the case. It actually depends on how you address certain crime problems. And again, we'll go through that stuff throughout the semester. Police officers deal with people at their lowest point in their lives. And certain people belonging to certain class, like socioeconomic class, right? Certain communities have more of those low moments than others. And so those shape certain views that the police can form, because they're just regular people like me and you who would also adopt those attitudes if this was your day-to-day reality. right? And so one thing that we found, though, is that if we increase the amount of women and minorities and gay people and bilingual people in our police force, so our police force more accurately depicts what the population they police is looking like. But that concludes today's lecture on the history of policing, right? So to sort of sum it all up, we went from coming to America from England and adopting many things about the English system. One of the biggest things that we adopted from the English system was the individual rights thing, right? And then as the colony started growing and people needed to start policing themselves because a lot of weirdos were coming in from England and ruining the little communities, right? We started getting the sheriffs and the patrol, the watchmen, right? And then that was pretty inefficient. And then we realized, okay, well, there are so many people now and we're all moving into cities now. We can't handle this. We need to now modernize things. And then when we modernize things became a little more efficient, but then the political machine overtook the police, and that kind of created all these problems that exist still today. And then then the Wickersham Commission happened, and Vollmer, being a part of that, said we need to have these new standards, and that gave birth to the professional era. And that led up until the 1960s when scientific research started coming in more, right? And we started challenging some of the basic ideas of some of the basic assumptions about policing and making more recommendations. And as that happened at the same time in the present day era, new racial tensions and political tensions have developed between the police and society. And that is where we are still today.